You're listening to Hot Cup of Code, the podcast where two Black women in tech drove conversations about code, career, and culture.
We're talking about breaking barriers, breaking code, and everything in between.
From debugging your first app to navigating big tech, we're here to percolate ideas and stir up inspiration.
So grab your favorite mug, get cozy, and let's dive into the blend of tech and culture. Welcome back to the Hot Cup of Code podcast. I'm Kat.
And I'm C.
Z, what are you sipping on today?
Today, I'm just enjoying a nice cup of coffee with milk, also known as cafe au lait.
Love it.
I'm using the Cafe Du Monde coffee blend, the coffee chicory blend.
Oh, I love their chicory coffee.
Yeah. It has like a natural creaminess to it that I really enjoy. So I only just put like the tiniest little splash of milk, and it's just a staple. What about you? What are you drinking today?
I have already had a very caffeinated cup of coffee earlier today, so I'm actually drinking a matcha latte that I made. So just a little bit more caffeine to get me through the day, but not much more.
Okay, I do enjoy a matcha latte.
Yeah, definitely. And it's just going to be that amount of caffeine to get me through the rest of the day, but not put me over the edge into coffee doom land. When you all are listening to this, it's probably 2025. Tell us about the future. Actually, no, don't tell us.
Yeah,
We don't
please
want to
don't.
know. Keep it to yourself. But for us, the holidays have just passed. And Zia, I would love to hear about your holiday.
Oh, my holidays were pretty hectic, but good.
Yeah.
So, right before Christmas, I went to GovTechCon, which was an awesome experience. I went with my brother, who's a mobile developer, and he's been trying to figure out a way to take that experience and like transition into like the cyberspace. So he got himself a ticket, rented his Airbnb, and I said,
Nice.
"Let me hitch a ride, bro." So I just kind of went as a tag along.
Yeah. Nice.
But it was such an incredible experience. There were 3 tracks. There was a cyber, a cloud, and a career track. And so even though I am not very knowledgeable in the cyberspace at all, I learned a lot. It was so well run, especially for this is the first year that they ran it. And yeah, it was just such a great experience. And then after that, I had to make the mad dash to finish doing like Christmas shopping and then hop around to see different family members. So it was very hectic, but so fun. How about you?
Honestly, the holidays were nice. I haven't really had a lot of opportunities to slow down in the last few months. So it was a great opportunity to slow down a little bit, spend time with all my loved ones. And to be honest with you, there just wasn't even enough hours in the day to get around to seeing everybody. But yeah, just it was nice to relax and, hang with family.
So sweet. I'm glad you got to spend so much time with your family. They get to see your beautiful face.
Obviously, for us, New Year's Eve is on the way. But we have been talking a lot about 2025 and what some of our goals and plans are for the new year. I would love to hear what are some of your New Year's resolutions or intentions for 2025?
Thank you for mentioning intentions, because I have historically been terrible with New Year's resolutions. So I am just trying to be a little bit more abstract about it. And I'm going to go with setting the intention to focus a little bit more on my professional development. I do have one specific goal. I want to speak at a conference. I have a session in mind, and I just need to do the call for papers and submit my applications and hopefully get my first opportunity to speak. So I wanted to be more intentional about my studying and attending conferences. This past year, I have gone to conferences as they've become available to me and kind of taken those opportunities. And I've also kind of studied with the intention to like pass an interview. So it's kind of just been like in response to these sort of events. So I'm definitely looking forward to coming up with a game plan for myself on a month-to-month basis and have some like mini goals as far as professional development. So what about you? What do the New Year's resolutions look like for you?
So I don't really make specific resolutions anymore. And a lot of that is because I would really get so down on myself whenever
Hmm.
I would fall off. And I think I was not someone that did a great job of being real with myself about what are the actual achievable things. So I
Yeah.
would have
Like,
the best of ideas and intentions. But yeah, it's
yeah.
exactly the typical like, I'm gonna drink 4 bottles of water every day,
The
and
gym 5 days a week, every week
exactly.
forever.
Yeah, and I don't know, maybe 1 bottle of water would have been a great goal. So instead, I actually took a page out of this author's book. Her name is Rachel Cargle, and I really admire her and her writing, and she had written a piece a few years ago now, about setting New Year's intentions or really creating some principles and values for the year. So that way,
Hmm.
the whole goal is to be doing things that are in alignment with those values. And there's so much room for flexibility and change. So I won't share all of mine because some of them are a little bit more personal to me, but visibility is one of my principles and values for this year. This podcast is totally part of that. It's hard to be so open with some of our experiences, but it's been so fun to share. And it's made me want to do a little bit more and to be a little bit more front facing in my professional development and be a little bit more intentional about what that looks like. And I think sometimes there's a pressure to have career advancement that just looks like it came out of nowhere. And I think
Right.
I'm okay to be seen trying and growing and changing.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think I have always been bad about the learning in public part. I
Yeah.
love to play around with technology. I love to try different things, and there's so much fun stuff out there, but I never talk about it. I never
Hmm.
publish it. So I think that's actually a good value to have in the new year. So I may be borrowing that from
Oh,
you.
totally. Yeah. And that's the best part about the values, right? We can have the same value and express it
Yeah.
differently. So I encourage you to steal it, take it, and think of some for yourself. And feel free to share those with us because I feel like there's a little bit of sort of visibility and community in that. But yeah, I'm really curious to see how that plays out. So I have some that are more for personal life only, but I feel like from the professional standpoint, visibility is going to be the focus, and that learning in public is really challenging and very
Right.
intimidating. And I give the advice to like students or to folks that are newer to their tech journey that they really have to have no fear about learning in public, and that should be the 24/7 approach, right? In year 10 of your career, you should still have that attitude. And so
Yeah.
I'm going to take that for myself this year.
I guess we can just jump into the topic on hand today. So, Kat and I are so excited to kick off our first technical conversation. And yeah, I think earlier this year when I was interviewing, and Kat, I'm sure you've had similar experiences, but something that keeps on popping up is object oriented programming in a lot of software engineering roles. So we thought that we could use this episode to talk about OOP.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of the languages that we saw being hired for or roles that utilize languages like Java and object-oriented programming languages
Hmm.
really have that built in. But even for roles that were not hiring for Java specifically, there was really that desire for object-oriented programming to be a skill. And I think especially at the enterprise level and especially in some of these larger settings, that understanding and familiarity and comfort with this particular programming paradigm is really valuable.
Yeah, I have pretty much exclusively been asked what are the four pillars of OOP. And it doesn't really matter if the role is for, like you said, a Java role or an object-oriented programming language role. They just want to see that you have that knowledge and that skill set. So what is OOP?
Right. That's the question.
That is the
Uh,
question.
Really, it is a programming paradigm that is founded in objects and their relationship to each other. So, objects being sort of foundational, self contained units, whether they hold data or whether they hold actions. And then classes really being ways to implement new iterations of these objects. I don't know if you would agree with that or offer any edit there.
No, yeah, that's pretty much it. And I think that if you're coming from a non-traditional background like we are, you came from like a programming boot camp where they teach you JavaScript, you might be more familiar with like a functional programming approach. So I sort of think about it like this. If I'm doing a task as like a human being, I'm sort of doing one thing and then the next thing and then the next thing. And that's kind of how functional programming works. So that's a paradigm where it's based on the actions or the behaviors, sort of causing the sequence of actions or behaviors. Whereas object-oriented programming, I think, is more based on the thing. So if you were thinking of it in terms of the English language, I'm just going off the dome here, but
Yeah.
a functional programming approach might be based on verbs or actions, whereas an object-oriented approach might be based on the nouns or the things. So I don't know if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
No, that I know. I'm totally following. And transparently, both of our backgrounds and start in tech is with JavaScript and in
Right.
that functional programming style. And I really like to think of functional programming a lot like a relay race where you can imagine every function being a member of that relay team. And you're thinking about pieces of information being handed off and handed off and handed off. And that is such a powerful way to program. But imagine if there were hundreds of members of this relay team. It would get really complicated and really bogged down. There would just be so much confusion there. And so when we're talking about some of these larger and interrelated units, whether they be some more structural or more data driven, there are real opportunities to cut down on some redundancy of code and cut down on some of the overwhelming interrelatedness by organizing your program using object-oriented programming.
Yeah, that's actually a really strong metaphor, I think. So I guess before we just dive a little bit deeper, let's kick off with the basics. So for anyone that's unfamiliar, so we have defined an object, which, like Kat said, is a unit that can contain data and behaviors. And that data might be called fields or properties, and the behaviors being functions or methods. And then, yeah, what is a function? Well, a function is basically a block of code that performs a task. And so something that we have in object-oriented programming is a class, which is basically like a template for creating these objects or instances of these objects that have these pieces of data inside of them.
Totally. And I think also an important caveat to add here is that you can write object-oriented code and write in that programming paradigm using languages like JavaScript or using languages that aren't really exclusive to that style of coding. So I think what's
Yeah.
cool about this is being people that have really strong technical backgrounds in JavaScript and then also have professional experience writing code in Java. I feel like our whole goal for this breakdown is talk about the basics. What are the foundations of it? I feel like this is a great start here guide, really, regardless of what code you write and what programming paradigms you typically use. I'm curious, and I'll throw this to you, Z. What
Okay.
is an example that you would give, like a real world use case for when someone would use object oriented programming and why?
Okay, yeah. So one thing that comes to mind is if you were to create a little like fighting game.
Mm,
You can write functions that represent each of the different moves for the character, and you can just call the functions back and forth for each character. But that might get overwhelming if you had 10 different types of fighters. So you can instead have an object that represents a character, and each one of those characters can have some set properties, right? Like, let's say each of our fighters has a 4-move set, and we can just create new instances of a fighter, and we can implement their specific moves that would be unique to them. So yeah, I think a video game example would be a good use case for object-oriented programming, so that you can manage your players, you can manage their health, and it's kind of
Hmm.
all contained in that single fighter character.
Yeah, totally. I
Um,
totally agree.
so what might be a good use case for like functional programming?
I think the core of it is that functional programming is best used for more independent tasks or more stateless operations. I'm just pulling from my own previous background. If you think about yourself calculating a restaurant order, you might want to make a total calculation or apply a discount or split the bill in a very predictable manner. Maybe split the bill in half or in thirds. And really, these are step by step processes. So this is a really great use case for functions independently operating and doing that one thing that they do, right? One function that applies a discount, one function that splits a bill predictably, one function that calculates the total. And you could mix and match those as needed in a way that kind of puts together that relay race that we were
Yeah.
articulating earlier.
Yeah, I think that's a good example, because maybe in one circumstance you're not going to split the bill, but you can always expect that at the end of this chain you need to calculate the total, or at the end of
Totally.
this chain there's always going to be like that calculation of tax. So yeah, these are like very predictable functionalities that are
Yeah.
never really going to change when
Yeah.
we're calculating a bill.
Totally.
So why at the enterprise level do all of these big companies want that object-oriented programming experience?
Yeah, and that's such a core question. And I think it speaks to a lot of what types of problems large companies are solving and a lot of the
Hmm.
problems that are being considered at the enterprise level. So we're dealing with large scale systems at the enterprise level, and the ability to reuse as much code as possible and to cut down on any redundant code is super important at that scale.
Yeah.
And so large companies, they're using object oriented programming because they're dealing with so much data, whether it be customers or products. And these are really maintainable for those large scale applications.
Yeah, and there's also that security that's sort of built into it, because, like
Mhm.
you said, there might be so many different departments that are each handling one aspect of the business, and they might have to interact with some of those other things. Like if there was a part of the company that handled customer data, they might also have to interact with product, but they shouldn't be able to modify the products. They shouldn't be
Exactly.
able to just do anything with them outside of, consume them when needed for those product and customer interactions. So it's a way to, yeah, manage their business at scale and just make sure that each component is really only getting the exact amount of access that it needs. So,
Yeah. Like a core separateness, reusability, maintainability,
mhm,
these are all really interesting advantages. And in the way that functional programming is
right.
not always ideal for tasks that involve state management, object oriented programming really excels at that. And so we think about that might look at an enterprise level. It's important.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I can't imagine having to manage the uh, current characteristics of any like given product or component, or just thinking of the scale just kind of makes my head my
Yeah.
head hurt. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's a great way to ensure that large company can actually manage their services well. So yeah, I think we could talk about this for hours, but let's just jump into the basics. So there are 4 pillars in object-oriented programming. So do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, totally. And so the 4 pillars are encapsulation, abstraction, inheritance, and polymorphism. And I am positive, whether you were aware or not, that you've interacted with at least one and probably all of these principles.
Hmm.
And they really come together to make that core of what gives object-oriented programming its power and flexibility and all of those benefits that we were just talking about. So, encapsulation is the first pillar, and encapsulation really talks about bundling data into one common unit, and that would be the class, right? That's where we see the class coming in. And also it has a little bit to do with controlling access to it, but more it's that unitness, right? So if you think of a menu as being something that has appetizers, entrees, desserts, you could
Hmm.
probably think of each of those different characteristics of the menu being in a class, or you could even consider there being a class for a beverage versus a class for food, and think about those menu subheadings as subclasses of the larger. And there's definitely different threads of ways that you could bundle data and information and relate them together.
Yeah, so I think going back to the video game example, you create that fighter based on your fighter class, and your player should be able to maybe change the fighter's name, but maybe they shouldn't be able to change that fighter's move set. So we can, instead of allowing an outside entity to have access to all of the properties of that fighter or character, we should be able to control what we want it to have access, the outside
Mhm.
entity to have access to. And so, yeah, that may mean that we can only just retrieve that fighter's move set so that our player can use it. But maybe they can customize the name if they wanted to. And by using encapsulation, you, the developer, would be in control of that.
Totally. Yeah. And it's really interesting as a way to consider what things, right? Capital T things
Hmm.
are and how they're related, and what are some ways that you could boil down a fighter or a user or a customer or a product
Right.
into ways that share information, but also have some hiddenness there. And I think that kind of touches a little bit on what the next pillar is. Tell us
Yes.
about abstraction.
So abstraction, and I always confuse encapsulation and abstraction because
Totally.
they are related. I mean, all of the pillars are related, but abstraction is about hiding complexity and
Hmm.
kind of only exposing what's necessary.
Yeah.
So an abstraction might be, if you're coming from a JavaScript background, you might be familiar with the array for each method. So for each is an abstraction of what might be under the hood,
Hmm.
a for loop. So we just get to call the for each method and it does that iteration for us. But under the hood, it's definitely, well, probably, I don't know. I haven't written, I did not write the language, but under the hood, it's probably some version of a loop. So abstraction is kind of giving the signature of that method, and we can specify that implementation, but ultimately that complex behavior is kind of hidden away.
Yeah. And I think a real life example that helps me to think about it is like using a TV remote. When you press the buttons on the remote, I don't know exactly what is going on in the hardware of my television, but I know that when I press channel 25, I'm getting channel 25. And it's about really machinations being hidden away, but the access is still existing, right? Being able to almost
Yes,
have a shortcut so that you don't need to know exactly what is going on under the hood.
exactly.
Mhm.
So the next paradigm is inheritance. And I love inheritance because once I learned what it was, it helped like so much other stuff click for me. You know, when you're first starting to learn programming, you're always hearing about the parent-child relationship.
Mhm.
And this object is a child of this class. And you're like, what is parent-child relationship? What does this mean? But yeah, it just simply means creating classes off of an existing one, but it also gets to take on its behaviors. So
Hmm.
this is a great example of the reusability of object-oriented programming, because when you create a parent class and it has some sort of standard behaviors associated with it, when you make a subclass or child class out of that, it takes in or inherits, ding, ding, ding,
Hmm.
or inherits that behavior by default. And so when you're creating that child class, you don't have to then redefine all of those methods or behaviors over again. They're just kind of built in, and you can add to them and you can modify them, but you don't have to rewrite them.
Yeah, and I think an interesting way to think about it is a larger umbrella and how there is so much shared behavior for all of the smaller umbrellas underneath. And
Hmm.
inheritance really is about creating those dynamics. And it's so interesting hearing it being called parent and child relationships, because it does feel sometimes like it's almost just as inherent to the behavior of object oriented programming as our own DNA.
Exactly, exactly. I feel like it's one of the pillars that sort of makes the most sense when you
Mhm,
think of it in like human terms, because it's kind of built into the definition. I think just going back to my gaming example, you can have like different fighters, but sometimes there's
mhm,
different classes. So maybe
mhm,
you might have a melee fighter and a ranged fighter. And so the parent class would be fighter, and maybe they all inherit 4 move sets, like a typical punch, kick, whatever. And then maybe our melee fighter gets an uppercut, and our range fighter also gets a javelin throw. I don't know. So,
mhm.
so that's an example of inheritance, because we can, like I said, add to. So our fighters, either way, they're going to have their 4 typical move sets, but then depending on their type of fighter, now we can add those extra abilities based on that. So there's some special, unique abilities to the different child classes, but the parent remains the same.
Yeah, or even thinking about like a store. If there was a store parent class, every store has a opening time, a closing time,
Hmm.
maybe a number of staff. And so the subclasses might be clothing store, grocery store, right? And so they're going to
Right.
inherit all of those properties from the overarching store class. So a clothing store will have opening hours and closing hours and number of employees. And so would a pet store. And so would a
And a
grocery store,
grocery
et
store.
cetera.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's really interesting. And I think that inheritance really feels like the pillar that it really illuminates some of the flexibility, and that's when you start to really have fun with object-oriented programming. And I think it really touches on the last pillar, which is polymorphism. And this is really when
Yes.
we're talking about how things take shape, right? And it's interesting because polymorphism means many shapes. And it really, where inheritance touches on the ability to be the same, polymorphism really touches on the flexibility and the ability to be different and to create differences.
Yeah, yeah. So I love talking about polymorphism, because this is really where you get to customize some of your objects. So
Hmm.
polymorphism, at least in Java, has like sort of 2 definitions or 2 ways that it can be implemented. So there's overriding and there's overloading. And I always get the 2 confused.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But overriding is kind of like what it sounds like. So you can have a function that can be overridden to have a different behavior. So
Hmm.
this is another area where inheritance and polymorphism kind of touch on each other. So let's say your object inherits a behavior from its parent class, but maybe it wants to implement that behavior in a different way. So then we can use that method or that behavior and have it be implemented in a different way. Okay, just going back to my gaming example, because now that's on the
Yeah, it's a good
dome.
one. Yeah.
So your fighter has a punch move that it inherits. It's part of its typical move set. But because that fighter is a melee fighter, it may have a super punch. So it's going to have that typical punch method, that all characters can do. But we can also have that punch method behave in a different way for the melee character. Maybe it does more damage than a typical punch. So we can still use that function's signature, but have it behave a different way.
Yeah, and I think also we've talked about stores and payments and, calculating tax and things. I think a good example of overloading would be a payment class that has the opportunity to take different payment methods like a credit card, PayPal, digital wallet, and also would have the ability to take maybe more than one form of payment. Right. So sometimes you can get into a situation where you need to create that flexibility because there isn't a specific use case for what you need. And what's awesome is that polymorphism lets you create new ones that don't override each other if they behave differently. But if you want to
Yes.
completely override the exact same style of behavior, you can do that.
Yeah, yeah. I like the example you gave of the different payment methods when describing overloading, because we can know that if it's a cash payment, if the program or the function takes in that cash payment type as an argument, it knows that it's going to process the payment as a cash transaction.
Hmm.
But if it takes in cash and then maybe a credit card, maybe then it behaves in such that it takes out the cash first, then processes the rest of the payment on credit
Yeah.
card, and then adds the credit card charge that sometimes happens. So that's just like a off the dome example of
Yeah, for sure.
how the method can behave differently based on the arguments that it's given. And that would be an example of overloading versus overriding, which is completely changing the behavior of that given method.
Or even while you were saying that, it didn't even occur to me what would happen in that payment example if someone had a coupon and then they had a different form of payment, or if they had a
Right.
coupon and two forms of payment. And polymorphism really allows you to have that flexibility to cover all of your potential use cases, which is cool and fun.
Yeah, yeah, because then you don't have to write a new function or method like payment only if there's credit card, payment
Yeah.
only if
Yeah.
there's coupons. You can
Yeah.
just have the payment method, and it can just have different versions based on the input. So yeah, so that is pretty much it. Those are the four pillars. Boom,
Yeah.
you
Just
now
that.
know just that. You now know everything about object-oriented programming.
Yeah, it's a really fun way to try out a new style of coding if it's something that you have not used to organize your code or your program. And I think it could also be a really interesting sort of primer for getting yourself back into some of that constant review and that repetitive revisit of even some of the more basic concepts. So if you are like us and you're someone that has had exposure to object oriented programming, it doesn't really matter how much you know. These are all topics that need to be revisited to stay fresh on the brain.
Right. Yeah. You don't want to get caught off guard in that interview and they're asking you what the four pillars are. And then you're like, I can only remember two of them. So it's
Yeah.
just good to have that refresher on the brain so that you can define these things, but also give examples and give examples through your own work as well. So I know for me, just coming from the functional programming background, it was a little bit difficult to start to translate the way that I was thinking about building out applications from a more like sort of procedural way of thinking to class-based and object-based interactions.
Totally.
So I think that it's a good way to, well, first of all, it's a good opportunity to just get hands on the keyboard. Maybe you have one of your old functional programming JavaScript apps and you can refactor it in an object-oriented way.
Yeah. And I think it can be a really fun way to push skills or to revisit some of them, or right. So Z and I have given many examples. And so imagine if in your next interview or in your next technical setting, you were able to point to your own work that really touches on all of these principles. That's like A plus valuable stuff. That's gold.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you are someone that is familiar with object oriented programming and that paradigm, I might challenge you to try building in a functional programming way. You actually can build in a functional programming way, kind of, in Java. So if that's like your home language and you want to give it a shot, you can maybe try to refactor in a functional way.
We just want to thank everybody that took time to leave us a review. Reviews, especially on Apple Podcasts, is like 3 button presses. I want to shout out somebody who took the time to write us a review. Obviously, all those 5 stars are so helpful. To Margot the Goat, wherever you are and wherever you're listening from, we thank you for your review. Margot said, I feel like I'm having a coffee with friends and talking shop. Love the pod. And that is what it feels like for us too. So I'm so happy that you tuned in and that you enjoyed it.
Yes, thank you so much. That's such a lovely review. That's for sure our intent. So I'm glad that's coming through. If you have any questions for us or suggestions, you can email us at hotcupofcode.show@gmail.com or find us on TikTok and Instagram. We would love to see what you're building. We're also on GitHub. So we have put a short example of all of these pillars in our GitHub account. You can find us at github.com/hotcupofcode. And yeah, let us know what you build.
Yeah, we want to see your mini apps. And I feel like that's the fun of coding.
For sure. So I think that wraps everything up nicely for this episode.
Yeah. And we run this podcast almost exclusively on caffeine. So if you want to buy us a coffee, we accept. And you can do that at buymeacoffee.com/hotcupofcode.
And I will be posting about GovTechCon a little bit more on our social accounts. You'll get some photos, maybe some videos. Maybe my brother Christopher might make an appearance. Who knows?
I hope so. I love Chris. And for those of you who don't yet follow us on TikTok and Instagram, we actually do post video snippets of the podcast, even though what we post on Apple Podcasts and Spotify is audio only. There is video. And if you want it, it's online. Go find it. We'll see you there.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us for another cup.
Yes.
And we'll see you in the next one. Bye.
Bye.